the nominations. According to Senator Reid, the cloture votes to end debate on those nominations are not expected until Tuesday morning. The nominees that Senator Reid was talking about: Richard Cordray to continue to be a director of the Consumer Financial Protection Board, Fred Hochberg to be president of the Export-Import Bank, Thomas Perez to be Labor Secretary, and Regina McCarthy as Administrator of the EPA. The remaining three are nominees to the National Labor Relations Board. Those are Richard Griffin, Sharon Block, and Mark Gaston Pierce. Kelly O'Donnell of NBC News sent a tweet quoting one part of what Senator Sessions said when he was on the floor earlier. Senator Sessions saying, "We don't need to be changing the rules of the Senate when it becomes inconvenient for the Majority Leader." Majority Leader Reid has filed cloture to end debate on 7 presidential nominations and is planning what's being called a joint meeting on Monday evening at 6 Eastern to bring all senators together in the old Senate chamber so both Republicans and Democrats can talk about the filibuster rules. Leader Reid wants to change the rules to allow nominations to be defeated with a majority vote rather than 60 votes. Here's an exchange between Senator Reid and Minority Leader McConnell, starting with Leader Reid filing cloture on the nominations.
Madam President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 51.
Is there objection? No. I'm sorry. The question is
on the motion to proceed.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it.
I send a cloture motion.
The motion is agreed to.
Thank you, Madam President. I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination: Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, Richard Cordray of Ohio to be director.
The clerk will report the closure motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Richard Cordray of Ohio to be director, Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, signed by 18 senators as follows. Reid.
I ask unanimous consent, Madam President, we not read the names.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
I now move.
The motion is agreed to.
I'm so sorry again to interrupt you. I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 100.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination: National Labor Relations Board, Richard F. Griffin, Jr. of the District of Columbia to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Richard F. Griffin, Jr. of the District of Columbia to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators as follows. Reid.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion to proceed? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to calendar number 101.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, National Labor Relations Board, Sharon Block of the District of Columbia to be a member.
I have a cloture motion, Madam President, at the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Sharon Block of the District of Columbia to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
I now
The
move
motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 104.
Questions on the motion to proceed? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
There's a
The
cloture
clerk
motion.
will report the nomination.
Nomination, National Labor Relations Board, Mark Gaston Pierce of New York to be a member.
I have a cloture motion. I would ask the clerk to report if the chair agrees.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Mark Gaston Pierce of New York to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask consent the mandatory quorum under Rule 22 of the Senate be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I now move to proceed to the legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 178.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Export-Import Bank of the United States, Fred P. Hochberg of New York to be president.
There's
Up to 10 minutes.
Without
of business,
objection.
although I think we're okay. Thank you, Mr. President. There's broad agreement that over-leveraged financial institutions significantly contributed, to put it mildly, to the 2008 financial crisis, and that they were bailed out because everyone knows that they are too big to fail. Years later, it's 5 years later now, there's an implicit assumption that the largest mega banks, the five or six largest banks in the country, still are too big to fail. That means that markets give them funding advantages that experts estimate are as high as 50 or 60 or 70 or even 80 basis points. That means when they go in the capital markets, they can borrow money at close to 1%. 80 basis points is 4/5. 80 points is 4/5 of 1%. They can borrow money at lower cost than virtually anyone else in our economy can. Studies have shown from Bloomberg that this can mean a subsidy of upwards of $80 billion to these 5, 6, 7 mega banks, these large mega banks. Last year, as a result, my colleague Senator Vitter and I began to push the banking regulators, the Federal Reserve, the Comptroller of the Currency, and the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to use stronger capital and leverage rules to end this too-big-to-fail subsidy. There's now bipartisan agreement that imposing more stringent capital and leverage requirements for the largest financial institutions could help prevent the next financial crisis and prevent future bailouts. Unfortunately, the Basel Committee responsible for the Basel III, named after a city in Switzerland, for the Basel III international capital rules adopted a mere 3% leverage ratio. In 2007, the investment banks Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers were leveraged 33-to-1 and 31-to-1, respectively. These institutions would have been compliant with Basel III with their international leverage ratio, and yet each would have become insolvent or nearly insolvent if the value of their assets declined by as little as 3%. That meant they only had sort of 3% protection, and if their assets declined more than 3%, they were what you'd call underwater. They simply were a failing, unsustainable institution or bank. I'm pleased to say that this week, regulators finally went beyond these inadequate rules and proposed a 6% leverage ratio for insured banks. I'd said earlier that Senator Vitter and I had argued for this and were pushing the banking regulators to do what they, in fact, did this week. The move is a necessary step in the right direction. It shows how far this conversation's gone in a short time. But there's more work to be done. Let me explain several things we can do now. First, the number needs to be higher. The Wall Street Journal editorial board, not a group of people with whom I often agree or with whom I say that I see eye to eye with very often, wrote this morning about these rules. Our preference would be to go north of 6%, to be higher. Why not approach the capital levels that small finance companies without government backing are required by markets to hold, which can run into the teens? They're required by markets. The mega banks, the market doesn't quite respond the same way because of their economic and their political power. Second, I'm still concerned that banks can use risk weights in their internal models to game capital rules. This amounts to the banks determining for themselves. This isn't some government body or some unaligned group of economists. This amounts to the banks determining for themselves how risky their assets are, thereby setting their own capital requirements. Financial Times said today the biggest banks plan to use optimization ratios. We're going to be able to pull a lot of levers, said an executive at a large U.S. bank on Wednesday. Analysts at Goldman Sachs noted in research for clients that banks have a lot of options to mitigate the impact. That's why we need simpler rules that can't be gamed by Wall Street, and this rule cannot be watered down by Wall Street lobbyists. There's no reason that agencies should not finalize these rules and begin implementing their rules tomorrow, not go through the long rules process. We can't wait. Small businesses and families can't afford to wait, neither can our economy. Finally, there's much more work to be done to rein in Wall Street megabanks. Senator Vitter and I have a bill that would do this, the bipartisan Too Big to Fail Act. It would restore market discipline by raising megabanks' capital requirements and limiting the federal safety net that supports them. I've also proposed legislation called the Safe Banking Act to cap the amount of non-deposit liabilities that any single megabank can have. The regulators have begun to do their jobs. It's time for Congress to do its job. This week was a good week. It was a step in the right direction. But it's time to finish the job. It's time to end Too Big to Fail once and for all. I thank the presiding officer. I yield the floor to another senator, if Senator McCain is ready, who has been a real ally in fighting on many of these bank issues.
Mr. President.
Arizona.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to join my colleagues, Senator Warren of Massachusetts, Senator Cantwell of Washington, Senator King of Maine, and also recognize the hard work of my friend from Ohio, who has been heavily involved in this issue in the past. And this legislation, it's bipartisan, and the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act, which will restore the much-needed wall between investment and commercial banking to lessen risk, restore confidence in our banking system, and better protect the American taxpayer. The original 1933 Glass-Steagall Act was put into place to respond to the financial crash of 1929. Like the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act that we are introducing today, it put up a wall between commercial and investment banking with the idea of separating riskier investment banking from the core banking functions like checkings and savings account that Americans need in their everyday life. Commercial banks traditionally use their customers' deposits for the purpose of Main Street loans within their community. They did not engage in a high-risk ventures. Investment banks, however, managed money for those who could afford to take bigger risks in order to get a bigger return and who bore their own losses. Unfortunately, core provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act were repealed in 1999, shattering the wall dividing commercial banks and investment banks. Since that time, we've seen a culture of greed and excessive risk-taking take root in the banking world, where common sense and caution with other people's money no longer matters. When these two worlds collided, the investment bank culture prevailed, cutting off the credit lifeblood of Main Street firms, demanding greater returns that were achievable only through high leverage and huge risk-taking, which ultimately left the taxpayer with the fallout. Leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, the mantra of bigger is better took over, and sadly it still remains. The path forward focused on short-term gains rather than long-term planning. Banks became over-leveraged in their haste to keep in the race. The more they lent, the more they made. Aggressive mortgages were underwritten for unqualified individuals who became homeowners saddled with loans they couldn't afford. Banks turned right around and bought portfolios of these shaky loans. Now, I know the 2008 financial crisis didn't happen solely because the wall of Glass-Steagall was knocked down. But I strongly believe the repeal of these core provisions have played a significant role in changing the banking system in negative ways that contributed greatly to the 2008 financial crisis, and I believe this culture of risky behavior is still in play. For example, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, on which I serve as ranking member, held a hearing in March of this year to discuss the findings of the subcommittee investigation report entitled J.P. Morgan Chase Whale Trades, a case history of derivatives risks and abuses. The hearing and the finding of the investigation describe how traders at J.P. Morgan Chase made risky bets using excess deposits that were partially insured by the federal government. If they wanted to make those bets on deposits and money that was not insured by the federal government, a senator from Massachusetts and I would not be here today. They used federally insured deposit, putting the taxpayers on the hook for their risky and ultimately failed investments. And I say again, Mr. President, the Dodd-Frank bill was the whole purpose of it, as sold to this Congress and the American people, was to ensure that no investment or a company or corporation or investment financial enterprise would ever be too big to fail again. Is there anybody that believes that these institutions, like I just talked about, J.P. Morgan and others, are not too big to fail? Of course they're still too big to fail. The investigation revealed startling failures and shed light on the complex and volatile world of synthetic credit derivatives. In a matter of months, J.P. Morgan was able to vastly increase its exposure to risk while dodging oversight by federal regulators. The trades ultimately cost the bank a staggering $6.2 billion in loss. This case represents another shameful demonstration of a bank engaged in wildly risky behavior. The London Whale incident matters to the federal government and the American taxpayer because the traders at J.P. Morgan were making risky bets using excess deposits, portion of which were federally insured. These excess deposits should have been used to provide loans for Main Street businesses. Instead, J.P. Morgan used the money to bet on catastrophic risk. The 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act will return banking back to the basics by separating traditional banks that offer savings and checking accounts and are insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation from riskier financial institutions that offer other services such as investment banking, insurance, swaps dealing, and hedge fund and private equity activities. Now, I believe big Wall Street institutions should be free to engage in transactions with significant risk, but not with federally insured deposits. The bill also addresses depository institutions' the use of products that did not exist when Glass-Steagall was originally passed, such as structured and synthetic financial products, including complex derivatives and swaps. And finally, the bill provides financial institutions with a 5-year transition period to separate their activities. There are many prominent individuals in the banking world that support returning to a modern-day Glass-Steagall banking systems, including FDIC Vice Chairman Thomas Hoenig. Last year, in his opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal entitled, quote, "No More Welfare for Banks," the FDIC and the taxpayer are the underwriters of too much private risk-taking. He lays out his plan to strengthen the U.S. financial system by simplifying its structure and making its institutions more accountable for their mistakes, which he calls Glass-Steagall for today. He ends his piece by stating, and I quote, "Capitalism will always have crises, and the recent crisis had many contributing factors. However, the direct and indirect expansion of the safety net to cover an ever-increasing number of complex and risky activities made this crisis significantly worse. We have yet to correct the error. It's time we did," and I couldn't agree more. Almost 3 years ago, Congress passed Dodd-Frank with the intent to overhaul our nation's financial system. I did not vote for Dodd-Frank because it did little, if anything, to tackle the tough problems facing our financial sector. When Dodd-Frank did so, it was create thousands of pages of new and complicated rules. Is there any member of this body who believes that Dodd-Frank has resulted in the end of too big to fail? The 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act may not end too big to fail on its own, but it moves the large financial institutions in the right direction, making them smaller and safer. This bill would rebuild the wall between commercial and investment banking that was successful for over 60 years and reduce risk for the American taxpayer. Mr. President, I ask that the piece entitled "No More Welfare for Banks" by Thomas Hoenig be inserted in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I'd like to thank the senator from Massachusetts, who I will freely admit has a great deal more knowledge, background, and expertise on this issue than I do. I appreciate her leadership. When the senator sought to join us here in the United States Senate, she committed to the people of Massachusetts and this country that she would be committed to certain significant reforms to ensure that we never again have the kind of crisis that devastated my state. Still today, nearly half the homes in my state are underwater, which means they are worth less than their mortgage payments, while Wall Street has been doing well for years. And the bailout was one of the more unfair aspects that I have seen in American history, and we can't revisit or fix history, but we sure can make sure that we've made every effort to make sure that these large financial institutions don't gamble with taxpayers' money. Mr. President, I thank the senator from Massachusetts, and it's a pleasure to join her in this effort as her junior partner. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of the senior senator from Arizona and to support the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act. I am honored to join Senators McCain, Cantwell, and King in introducing this bill, and I particularly want to commend Senator McCain for his hard work and his long-time dedication on this issue. Senator McCain is a real leader here in the Senate, and while we don't agree on every issue, he's a fighter who stands up for what he believes in. Senator McCain's worked hard to shed light on the too-big-to-fail problem, and he's been thinking about how to bring back elements of Glass-Steagall for years. I'm proud to join with him today to speak about the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act. I am glad to be his partner in this endeavor. You know, Washington is a partisan place, and this Congress has its share of partisan bills, but we have all joined together today because we want a safe future for our kids and for our grandkids. And we know that 5 years ago, Wall Street's high-risk bets nearly brought our economy to its knees, disrupting the lives and livelihoods of hardworking Americans. We know that the economic downturn did not affect just Democrats or just Republicans or just independents. It affected everyone. Over the past 5 years, we've made some real progress in dialing back the risk of future crises. But despite the progress that's been made, the biggest banks continue to threaten the economy. The 4 biggest banks are now 30% larger than they were just 5 years ago. And they have continued to engage in dangerous, high-risk practices that could once again put our economy at risk. You know, the big banks weren't always allowed to take on big risks while enjoying the benefits of both explicit and implicit taxpayer guarantees. 4 years after the 1929 crash, Congress passed the Banking Act, or the Glass-Steagall Act as it's known, which is best known for separating the risky activities of investment banks from the core depository functions like savings accounts and checking accounts that consumers rely on every day. For years, Glass-Steagall played a central role in keeping our country safe. Traditional banking stayed separate from high-risk Wall Street banking. But big banks wanted the higher profits they could get from taking on more risk. And investors wanted access to the insured deposits of traditional banks. So Wall Street investors combined with the big banks to try to weaken and repeal Glass-Steagall. Starting in the 1980s, regulators at the Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency responded, reinterpreting long-standing legal terms in ways that slowly broke down the wall between investment banking and depository banking. And finally, after 12 attempts to repeal, Congress eliminated the core provisions of Glass-Steagall in 1999. Now, the 21st century Glass-Steagall Act will reestablish the wall between commercial and investment banking, make our financial system more stable and more secure, and protect American families. Like its 1933 predecessor, the 21st century Glass-Steagall Act will separate traditional banks that offer checking and savings accounts and are insured by the FDIC from the riskier financial services. It will return banking, basic banking, to the basics. The 21st century Glass-Steagall Act also puts in place some important improvements over the original Glass-Steagall. It reverses interpretations that the regulators had used to weaken the original Glass-Steagall. Our bill also recognizes that financial markets have become more complicated since the 1930s, and it separates depository institutions from products that did not exist when Glass-Steagall was originally passed, such as structured and synthetic financial products, including complex derivatives and swaps. The idea behind the bill is simple. Banking should be boring. Anyone who wants to take big risks should go to Wall Street, and they should stay away from the basic banking system. Now, I want to be clear. The 21st century Glass-Steagall Act will not by itself end too big to fail and implicit government subsidies, but it will make financial institutions smaller and safer and move us in the right direction. By separating depository institutions from riskier activities, large financial institutions will shrink in size and won't be able to rely on federal depository insurance as a safety net for their high-risk activities. It will stop the game that these banks have played for too long. Heads, the big banks win and take all the profits, and tails, the taxpayer gets stuck with all the losses. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation to reduce the risk in the financial system and to dial back on the likelihood of future crises. Exactly 70 years ago, the halls of the Senate filled with excitement and history when it passed the original Glass-Steagall. The financial industry at that time experienced some big, immediate changes. But despite all kinds of claims to the contrary, Wall Street survived, and the sky did not fall. In fact, the American people enjoyed a half-century of financial stability and a strong, growing middle class. The regular financial crises that had occurred over and over before Glass-Steagall faded away, and our economy became stronger and more stable. Few in Congress have been around long enough to have lived through the Great Depression that led to the first Glass-Steagall, but we were all around during the 2008 financial crisis. It's been 5 years since then, but our economy has still not fully recovered, and the downturn has had an impact everywhere on our families and businesses, retirees and workers, school children and college students. We need a banking system that serves the best interests of the American people, not just the few at the top. The 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act is an important step in the right direction. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this measure. Thank you, Mr. President, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Hill sent out a tweet quoting Republican leader McConnell. Senator McConnell saying, "Reid will be the worst Senate leader in history if he goes nuclear." A story in the Hill says Senate Republicans vow no other legislation will pass the Senate until after the next elections if Democrats trigger the nuclear option to change the chamber's rules. Instead, Republicans say they'll campaign against the Democrats' quote, tyranny of the majority in hopes of regaining control of the Senate in 2014 when 21 Democrats face re-election. The tactic contemplated by Reid entails changing the Senate rules to a simple majority vote to prohibit filibusters against executive and judicial branch nominees. Here are the two leaders on the floor earlier.
Consent that I think would set up these votes in a much more expeditious way than the way the majority leader is proceeding. But first, let me just say, these are dark days in the history of the Senate. I hate that we have come to this point. We've witnessed the majority leader break his word to the United States Senate. And now our request for a joint meeting of all the senators has been set for Monday night, a time when attendance around here is frequently quite spotty, in an obvious effort to keep as many of his members from hearing the concerns and arguments of the other side as possible. It remains our view that for this to be the kind of joint session of the Senate that it ought to be, given the tendency of the Senate to have sparse attendance on Monday night, to have this meeting on Tuesday before it's too late. Having said that, a more expeditious way to accomplish most of what the majority leader is trying to accomplish would be achieved by the following consent. I ask unanimous consent that on Tuesday at 2:15, the Senate proceed to consecutive votes on the confirmation of the following nominations. Number 104, that's Pierce to be a member of the NLRB. Number 102, Johnson to be a member of the NLRB. And number 103, Ms. Amara to be a member of the NLRB. Now, I might just say parenthetically, if those nominees were confirmed, coupled with the two nominees illegally appointed, whose illegal appointments continue to the end of the year, the NLRB would have a full complement of 5 members and able to conduct its business. I further ask consent that following those votes, the Senate proceed to the cloture motion filed on calendar number 99, that is Perez, to be Secretary of Labor. And further, if cloture is invoked, the Senate immediately proceed to a vote on the confirmation of the nomination. I would add parenthetically, that would eliminate the post 30 hours, assuming cloture were invoked, on the very controversial nominee, Perez, to be Secretary of Labor. Further, the Senate vote on the cloture motion filed on calendar number 98, McCarthy, to be EPA Director. And if cloture is invoked, the Senate proceed to vote on the confirmation of the nomination. Also, eliminating the 30 hours post-cloture, if cloture is invoked, on McCarthy. And I might add that the ranking member of the Environment Committee supports cloture on the McCarthy nomination. Thereby, it's reasonable to assume that cloture would be invoked on what is, for a lot of our members, including myself, a very controversial nomination. I further ask that the Senate then vote on the cloture motion that was filed on number 178. This is someone named Hochberg, to be president of the Export-Import Bank. And again, if cloture is invoked, the Senate proceed to an immediate vote on the confirmation of that nomination, again, eliminating the 30 hours post-cloture, assuming cloture is invoked, and I assume that it will be. Finally, I ask consent that the following votes listed above, the Senate proceed to cloture votes on the remaining 3 filed cloture motions. Now, before the chair rules, what this allows, as I indicated, is for the Senate to work efficiently through a series of nominations in a quicker fashion than the Majority Leader has proposed. They would get their votes, and there would not be a delay. This would only leave discussion and votes on the 3 remaining illegally, according to the federal courts, the 3 remaining illegally appointed nominations. Mr. President, that's my consent.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, no matter how often my friend rudely talks about me not breaking my word, I'm not going to respond talking about how many times he's broken his word. That doesn't add anything to this little debate we're having here, so he can keep saying that as much as he wants. All we have to do is look back at the record today. And as to the caucus Monday night, my members will be here. I don't understand, unless this is part of the overall pattern that we've come to expect around here, to not do anything today you can do tomorrow. Mr. President, we're going to have a vote at 5:30. Members are usually pretty good at getting here for votes at 5:30. And I also, Mr. President, am stunned by boasting about the ranking member on the EPW committee suddenly saying the light. And he's going to allow Gina McCarthy to get a vote. Now, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that something to cheer about? He's held this woman up. He's the one that's responsible for 1,100 questions to her. That's what's wrong here, Mr. President. Now, this is so transparent, what my friend has asked. He has said he wants to approve 2 Republican members in NLRB. Let's have those votes first, and only 1 Democratic nominee. What does this mean? It means within a couple months, the Republicans have a majority of the NLRB. I don't blame them for wanting that. They don't like the organization anyway, just like they don't like Cordry's organization. So I can understand that the Republican leader would like to get consent to create a Republican majority in the NLRB. But it's so obvious, I object.
Objection is heard.
So, Mr. President, we are going to have a caucus Monday at 6 o'clock, the old Senate chamber. We're going to vote at 5:30. And I would hope with something this important, we'll have attendance. I know my caucus will be there. And if nothing is resolved there, which the way things have been going today, likely it won't be. So we'll have a vote sometime early Tuesday morning on these nominees.
Mr. President, the majority leader always reminds me he can have the last word, and I'm sure he can have the last word again. Speaking for Senator Vitter, he did ask for a lot of information from the new prospective director of the EPA. So did Senator Boxer. She asked for 70,000 pages herself, but he was satisfied with the responses that he got. This is how the process ought to work. This is how it's worked for decades. You're trying to get answers to questions. You're trying to engage in some kind of prediction as to how somebody might operate in the future. What the majority leader has really been saying here all along is he wants the confirmation process to be speedy and for the minority to sit down and shut up. He believes that advise and consent means sit down and shut up. Confirm these nominees when I tell you to. Now, the reason he's taken a lot of heat over this is because he's broken his word to the United States Senate, given back last January that we had resolved the rules issue for this Congress. And I know for a fact, even though he may get his 51 votes, there are a lot of Democrats who are not happy with where you are. When they tell me that, the Republican I expect they'd be least likely to want to tell that to. I know what's going on here. They've been hammered into line. This has been personalized by the majority leader. You got to do this for me. And what's astonishing here is he's saying you got to do this for me because you got to help me break my word, go back on everything I said in my own biography just a few years ago. You got to help me look bad. You got to help me break my word, violate what I said in my own biography, create unnecessary controversy in the United States Senate, which has done major bills on a bipartisan basis all year long and had begun to get back to normal. This is really hard to understand. And this is why my members are astonished at where we are. They're scratching their heads, saying, who manufactured this crisis? We know who manufactured it. The guy right over here to my left. So this is really a sad, sad day for the United States Senate. And if we don't pull back from the brink here, my friend, the majority leader, is going to be remembered as the worst leader of the Senate ever. The leader of the Senate who fundamentally changed the body. It makes me sad. Some of my members are angry. I'm more sad about it. But it's a shame that we've come to this. I sure hope all the Democratic senators are there Monday night. I'm certainly going to encourage my members to be there. It's high time we sat down and tried to understand each other, because many members on the other side are hearing a different version from the facts that are largely unrelated to reality. So, Mr. President, I know my friend, the majority leader, will have the last word. He reminds me that frequently on a daily basis, that the difference between being the majority leader and the minority leader is he gets the last word. So I'll yield the floor and listen to the last word.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
No matter how many times he says it, he tends to not focus on what he has done to the Senate. As I indicated earlier, there's lots of time for name-calling. But we know it's replete in the record as delivered this morning how he said there would be no filibusters. We would follow the norms of the Senate, only extraordinary circumstances. The extraordinary circumstances have come because we're in session, I guess. The only person that I know that thinks things are going just fine here is my friend. The American people knows this institution is being hammered hard, and he doesn't have to worry about me. Heat I've taken. I haven't taken any heat. I had a very nice caucus today. My caucus was very thoughtful. We heard from out of my 54 senators, we probably heard from 25 or 26 of them. The attendance was nearly perfect. So, Mr. President, I don't want him to feel sorry for the Senate, certainly not for me. And I'm going to continue to try to speak in a tone that is appropriate. His name-calling, I guess he follows, I hope not, the demagogic theory that the more you say something, if it's false, people start believing it. But, Mr. President, it's quite interesting that he thinks that the Richard Cordray, who no one says there's a thing wrong with this man, former Attorney General of the state, heavily populated state of Ohio. Democrats and Republicans have said he's a good guy. This man's been waiting for 724 days. Assistant Secretary in Defense, 292 days. Monetary Fund Governor, 169 days. EPA, 128 days. NLRB, 2 of them, 573 days. You have 15 of them. The average time waiting is 9 months. So, Mr. President, and of course reshuffling the votes as he wants them, I mean, that's a laugher. He wants to have a majority of this NLRB to be Republicans. I don't think that's really a good idea. So, Mr. President, we're going to have our caucus Monday. I think it was a good idea. You know, I've tried to have them before. My friend has objected to them. That's replete in the press. But we're going to have this one. I'm happy to do that. My friend said the process works. The process works. The status quo is good. I don't think so.
Mr. President,
Republican leader.
Of course, the majority of the NLRB would not be Republicans, and I've mentioned to the administration on several occasions, send us up 2 nominees who are not illegally appointed, but we can't seem to get that done. I mean, the taint attached to the 2 NLRB nominees and to Mr. Cordray, who I agree is a good man and many of our members support, is that they were illegally appointed. But, of course, the agencies have not been at a disadvantage. They're there, waiting. He may have been waiting to be confirmed, but he's not waiting to do the job. He's in office. The 2 NLRB members in office. The question is, do we respect the law? A federal court has said the 2 NLRB members were illegally appointed. Mr. Cordray, unfortunately, was appointed on exactly the same day in exactly the same way. Is the Senate just completely lawless? Do we not care what the federal courts say? I'm just stunned at where we are. It's pretty clear to me that all the other nominees are highly likely to be confirmed. So what it really comes down to is that the majority leader is going to break the rules of the Senate, to change the rules of the Senate in order to confirm with 51 votes 3 illegally appointed positions that the federal courts have told us are unconstitutionally appointed. That is the rationale for the nuclear option. That's why I say it's a sad day for the Senate, a sad day for America.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
Illegally appointed. Why did President Obama recess appoint Cordray and the 2 NLRB members? Because Republicans had blocked them. Blocked them, blocked them, blocked them. Now, we count Cordray as only 571 days. That went on long before he got there. Elizabeth Warren is the one that set up this program. They said, no chance, don't even think of bringing her here. And that's where he came with Cordray. Elizabeth Warren found him as Attorney General of Ohio. So these big crocodile tears, you know, you have recess appointments because the president had no choice if he wanted his team to work. And he said, we would be happy to process them quickly. Just like Richard Perez has been processed quickly. Just like all these people have been processed quickly. Sorry, Mr. President, sorry. So there's not a chance that we're going to let the NLRB be dominated by Republicans. That one organization above all looks out for working men and women in this country should not be dominated by Republicans, and it's not going to be. So I repeat, this issue could be resolved very quickly. I had somebody out here at my stakeout say, what happens if you get cloture on everybody? So there's no problem. They can all vote against these people. They can vote against them, every one of them. But they, on procedural basis, they're holding up votes on people who are well qualified and would be approved by the Senate if they got a vote. So this is a little strange deal. Talk about marshaling your troops to do something that's absolutely wrong. It's that. If they're so worried about the rules changes around here, it would seem to me they should approve 3 qualified people that no one suggests there's anything wrong with any of them. And why were they recess appointed? Because the Republicans forced President Obama to do that. So, Mr. President, there will be no further votes. Next vote will be Monday at 5:30.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
On the issue of delay, I'm trying to avoid bursting out in laughter here. The 2 NLRB nominees were sent up to the Senate December the 15th, 2011. December the 15th, 2011. Before their paperwork got here, 2 weeks later, the President recess appointed them. Delay? Their paperwork hadn't even been arrived. Hadn't even arrived. The committee couldn't do anything with them, and a couple of weeks later, they were recess appointed. Now, that's not my definition of a delay by any objective standard. The core issue here, no matter how much the majority leader tries to obfuscate and discuss other matters, is he is prepared to break the rules of the Senate, to change the rules of the Senate for 3 nominees who were unconstitutionally appointed according to the federal circuit court in Washington, D.C. For that, the majority leader proposes to use the nuclear option. It's a sad commentary on today's Senate.
Sad
Majority Leader.
day in the Senate created by the Republicans, Mr. President. This rule change, he keeps talking about the rule change. Mr. President, the presiding officer knows that the Constitution is pretty clear. It's clear there's one paragraph that says treaties take 2/3 vote. In that same paragraph, how many votes does it take to confirm a nomination? Simple majority. That's in our Constitution. Since 1977, rules have been changed in this body 17 times. Not by fancy things done by the Rules Committee, but right here in the Senate. So we have 3 people who are qualified, and if the Republicans want to avoid a problem, obviously they don't. What they want to do is continue. Can you imagine, Mr. President, the American people are looking at this and saying, the Republican leader thinks the Senate's going just fine, the status quo is good? Look at any poll. Gallup poll did one. 86% of the American people. Why do they think things are bad? Because of gridlock, not doing important things. Sure, we were able to get a few things done, but I have been here a while, and we've done some good things this year, but we should be doing lots of good things, not focus on immigration and a farm bill that's passed twice, on a postal bill that we passed once, we haven't passed it again. We talk a lot about WRDA. I'm glad we got that done, okay, WRDA. And I'm not going to denigrate my friend, the chairman of that committee, but, Mr. President, that bill is a mere shadow of its former self because of what the Republicans have done to make a mockery of what goes on here. All we want is for the President of the United States, whoever that might be, Democrat or Republican, to be able to have the team he wanted as contemplated in that document called the Constitution of the United States. That's not asking too much.
We just got word that Vice President Biden will swear in Ed Markey as a senator from Massachusetts on Tuesday. That's scheduled for 10 a.m. Eastern. Mr. Markey has been a member of the House for 37 years. He's taking the seat vacated by John Kerry, who's now Secretary of State. Here's more about the filibuster rules being debated in the Senate. Raju, senior congressional reporter for Politico, joining us. What came out of the meeting between Majority Leader Harry Reid and Senate Democrats on the proposed changes to filibuster rules?
Well, it sounds like that the Harry Reid is ready to go forward with the so-called nuclear option, which is to change the Senate rules by 51 votes rather than the normal threshold of 67 votes. That higher threshold is usually set to make it harder for rules changes to occur. But what Reid says that he's so frustrated with the use of the minority party to block nominations and legislation from moving forward that he's going to invoke this very unusual procedure to change the rules by 51 votes. And what Reid wants to do is to invoke this nuclear option to essentially change the filibuster rule, so no longer will 60 votes be required to confirm, to overcome a filibuster facing presidential nominees for executive branch positions. So this will only affect executive branch positions, not judicial nominees, not legislation going forward. But Reid wants to move forward so that no longer can a senator block a nominee for the EPA, for the Labor Department, for the Defense Department by requiring 60 votes. Instead, 51 votes would be required to move forward, a majority of the Senate.
So you said that Majority Leader Reid wants to move forward. What would the next step be in the Senate?
There is going to be a joint meeting on Monday evening in the old Senate, room just off of the Senate floor. This is very rare. Rarely do both parties decide to actually meet in one setting, and they're going to talk about the use of whether or not the Senate should go forward. That seems to me to be a bit of a dog and pony show. I don't think that's actually going to change Reid moving forward. What may change Reid going forward is if McConnell, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, essentially caves to Reid's demand and gives him the spate of pending nominees, allows them to be confirmed by 51 votes. Right now, that seems very unlikely, and Reid is threatening to move forward with this unprecedented step in which future majority leaders could very well cite to further weaken the filibuster rules on both legislation and judicial nominees.
Senate Democrats have been toying with this idea for changing the filibuster rules for the last year or so. What's the impetus for this latest effort?
The impetus are several nominees who are stuck, who Harry Reid has tried to get confirmed. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau nominee, Richard Cordray, the National Labor Relations Board has several nominees who would allow that agency to continue to function, as well as there are a couple other nominees who are awaiting action. The Labor Department Secretary Tom Perez and Gina McCarthy to head the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, on Labor and EPA, it sounds like that McConnell would allow those votes to go forward. So the dispute really is around the NLRB and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But remember, those
acknowledge our mistakes. But I was on my way home and I knew I forgot something. That was to come and close the Senate. So here I am. We'll do it now. I'm sorry, but I only held you up about 10 minutes.
We're in a quorum call.
Yeah,
we're in a quorum call.
I ask consent that it be vitiated.
Without objection.
So I don't have to admit my frailties now, because there was no record here. Mr. President, thank you very much for your patience. I ask consent that the Committee on Finance be discharged from further consideration, H.R. 2289.
Clerk will report.
H.R. 2289, an act to rename Section 219C of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 as the K. Bailey Hutchison Spousal IRA.
Is there objection? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be read a third time, passed, motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed H. Conres 43.
Clerk will report.
Conres 43, authorizing the use of Emancipation Hall and the Capitol Visitor Center for a ceremony honoring the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela on the occasion of the 95th anniversary of his birth.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that concurrent resolution be agreed to, the motion reconsider be laid on the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Judicial Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 191.
Clerk will report.
S-Res 191, designating July 27, 2013 as National Day of the American Cowboy.
Is there